Hello and welcome to Broad History. I'm Isabelle Hogol. To my shame, my double shame as a French woman, I could not until this week have named a single novel by George Sand. I knew of her, of course, because she's famous, but not so much because of her work, which hasn't stayed in the canon, I have to say, the way that her contemporaries have. That would be Victor Hugo, Flaubert, Balzac, Stendhal a little bit earlier, Zola a little bit later. So if you're a reader of French lit, that will sort of situate you. And I read all of these men in school, never Georges Sand. And we'll certainly talk about why that is. But no, I know of her because of her personality. Georges Sand sort of looms over the 19th century as this larger than life character, early queer icon, a gender bending woman in men's clothes, to French people, sort of the female Oscar Wilde. And then I read Becoming George, which is the biography, the new biography of George Sand by my guest this week, Fiona Sampson. And I have to admit that I found her to be both a really, really interesting woman, but not nearly the scandalous or unusual character that I think pop culture had made her out to be in my mind. So we're going to break all that down and also through her talk about gender expectations, creative careers, and the lives of women in the 19th century with Fiona Sampson. Fiona, hello.
Hello, Isabel. Thank you for inviting me. This is going to be great.
My great pleasure. And so I should say that you're a biographer of George Sand, but also of Mary Shelley and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, as well as a professor and a renowned British poet as well in your own right. So when did you encounter George Sand? Why this interest in this woman who, as I say, has somewhat fallen out of the canon?
Well, I think two things really. One is that I'm really interested in the way women fall out of the canon in the way that the men don't. And
Mm-hmm.
the other is that in my first life, I was a musician, I was a violinist. And so if you're a musician, you know about, obviously, you know about Chopin. And if you know about Chopin, you know there was this kind of strange figure who has a man's name, but it's a woman, but she seems to be bad for him, but at the same time, she was part of his life for a long time. There is this sense of a kind of musty glamour
Mm.
around George Sand. And as you kindly said, I've already written, really, it's a trilogy. I've written about Mary Shelley and I've written a biography of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And Barrett Browning and George Sand seem to me to share having been tipped out of the canon, although they were still in the canon when I was a kid. I mean, there was certainly, even in an English public library, George Sand was on the bookshelves when I was, in school. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning was in the poetry anthologies. But in the decades since, their reputation has superseded their work enormously. There are particular things around Elizabeth Barrett Browning and a TV schlock series and play, and it had many iterations, a show on Broadway called The Barretts of Wimpole Street, which is all about Elizabeth Barrett Browning as not a great writer with a sense of vocation and destiny, but Elizabeth Barrett Browning as the girlfriend of Robert Browning and then wife, and as kind of a hindrance to him and a kind of inversion of actual literary history, where in fact she was the literary pioneer, she was his senior and so on. And Mary Shelley, although Frankenstein has enormously now taken up cultural space, and that's wonderful to see, very much of that cultural space is around the James Whale 1931 movie with Boris Karloff being the shuffling monster, and less of it is actually, this was written by a teenage woman, and she wrote this fabulous novel, which is a kind of hybrid myth. And again, perhaps the opposite, really, that when I was, say, a student, the idea was that Mary Shelley hadn't really written Frankenstein. Hey, maybe she had a great idea, but really, Percy Bysshe worked it up into a literary work. And that, of course, is not the case. It's also not the case with Georges Sand, that there was no work, there was only a scandalous private life. And I think this kind of being subject to scandal is something that really women still now, women stars now, celebrities, actors, they're not anymore novelists, are still subject to. But I think all of us, women in our working lives, are more subject to personal reputation than our male peers. And I think that it's tragic for us that we don't know our own canon, that we let these women be disappeared, which makes it much easier to say, of course, women can't do very much. Look, they never have. On the contrary, even denied education, even denied the fabulous education that privileged 19th century white men had, women managed it. They managed to write masterpieces, they managed to be highly productive, even while they're having babies and goodness knows what. So, in fact, I wanted to kind of invert the story with which we tend to live.
Wonderful. That's music to my ears. That's exactly the point of the Broad History Project, is to remind people women have done all these things in the past. We just haven't kept track of them as we have of the
Yes.
men who have. And to Mary Shelley, because you bring her up, obviously there's been a new adaptation of Frankenstein, so she's again, back in the canon. I was reading something fantastic. I think I'll try and find it and put it in the show notes for the podcast, about how we're still waiting for a film adaptation of Frankenstein, as wonderful as this latest one is, that takes a woman's perspective of Frankenstein, actually says all the things that she
Yes.
tried to say in the book
Yes.
that are just completely missed in every adaptation that we've had so
Yeah.
far.
And I think the
Um,
Del Toro film is much closer to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein
mhm,
than any of the other Frankensteins to date. And I think she's talking about hubris in general. She's got this framing story about that ends on the Arctic ice. He's brought that in. The creature is a tragic figure, not a monster. That's Mary Shelley too. Hurrah for that. But
mhm.
you're right. Questions about why it might be the case that something goes wrong when men try to, as it were, give birth. That's not addressed at all, of course.
Let's go to George Sand, however.
Yes.
um, and let's start with her childhood, the world that she's born into. She went by many names, and her first one, her birth name, is going to be a mouthful for the non-French speakers. My apologies. Amantine Aurore Lucille Dupin de Francueil. I don't get to use my French that often on this podcast. Can you tell me about sort of her and the world that she's born into, that Aurore Dupin is born into in
Yes,
1804, I
that's
believe?
right. July the 1st or 4th, we're not quite sure, 1804. As you will know, and most Anglophone listeners won't know or will have forgotten, of course, it's revolutionary France. This is a France where everything is, as it were, called by a new name. This is a France of the revolutionary calendar, of the département suddenly being introduced, of a kind of partial deconstruction of the old aristocratic, I want to say fiefdoms, although I'm saying that metaphorically, divisions of the country and ruling class. And Aurora herself sits right on that kind of the fault line because, although not in an unusual way historically, because her mother is a former call girl, a Parisian working class girl who was on the streets by the time she was 14 and whose father and stepfather were both bird catchers. And her and Aurore's father was an aristocratic cavalry officer whose mother was the illegitimate daughter of the great Marshal of France, Maurice de Saxe, sorry. And he himself was the illegitimate son of the King of Poland. I mean,
Mm.
not quite then King of Poland when he was conceived. So there's a kind of zigzag zip of illegitimacy that goes through the family tree. But because Aurora was lucky enough that her parents quickly married a month before she was born, they conferred on her legitimacy, which had huge practical consequences. But it meant that, particularly in her childhood, when for reasons I'm sure we'll come to, she moved between care by her paternal family and her mother's care, there's a kind of fracturing of her identity, a sense of she doesn't quite belong to either class, and it is still class, or set of economic prospects. And her identity is very contested, it's fluid. And you have this sense when she's writing, particularly in her autobiography, in Histoire de ma vie, about her childhood, of a kind of anxious child who's trying to do it right with both kind of sets of families, to both kind of family stories, trying to belong to both sets of codes and perhaps finding that very difficult. A kind of quite intense sense of self-invention going on, even from early childhood. And she had an illegitimate older half-sibling on either side. Her father had had Hippolyte, and her mother had had Caroline. So she has an older half-sister, illegitimate, and an older half-brother, illegitimate.
Yeah, her family, I find that fascinating because it is, I'm sorry to say, a bit of a cliche of France, but there is just so many mistresses. A very posh grandmother who keeps her to these very high society expectations of how a woman should behave is herself a little bit on the edge in terms of her own identity, and perhaps is all the more attached to defending that gentry behavior. A girl raised in a convent, we'll get to that, raised, educated in a convent like proper girls of her society, while also being a country tomboy who runs
Yeah.
around, plays with horses and plays in the woods and has a quite idyllic childhood. Let's talk about Noan, the house, her grandmother's house that she grows up in.
Yes. So Nohant is, well, it's a beautiful late 18th century house, but it had been sort of reconstructed just actually, 20 years earlier on the site of a castle. So there's still some battlements and so on. So it's very much a product of Aurore's own grandmother's tenure. I mean, the man she had bought it from had been the man who'd had it rebuilt, but the gardens are laid out by the grandmother and so on. And um, it's not huge. It's very much a manor house rather than a mansion. It's right on the village square. I mean, right abutting it. And okay, the village is not very big, but it's right close to the church. Although there's a high wall around the court of honor, I mean, it's sort of overlooked by the country neighbors, which is something, Aurora remarks on. And she talks about how in her childhood she was speaking dialect and she's running around and getting dirty. And her mother is sort of allowing this because I think it's to get back at her mother-in-law, to get back at Marie Aurore de Saxe, to resist the gentrification, while at the same time aspiring to it, while at the same time having made this advantageous marriage, having managed to produce an heir who, as it were, luckily for Aurore, died. So Aurore had a younger brother who died in infancy when she was just 4. So Sophie Victoire, Parisian street girl, has arrived at Nohant as the wife of the heir to Nohant, having produced the next heir. And then very quickly, the little boy dies. The grandmother wants to take custody of Aurore, and Sophie Victoire's kind of nose is put out of joint. And so I think, as people do when they're defensive, she pushes back by becoming more by embracing sort of vulgarity in a way. But and really, even in adulthood, the adult George Sand struggles with her loyalty to her mother, who she describes as musical, charming, irrational, can't concentrate, spontaneous, but very moody, and her grandmother, who is not moody, who encourages her to learn, encourages her in lots of skills, encourages her manners, but whose affection is is conditional, as a reward. And it's clear that almost in adulthood, still in late adulthood, because the autobiography is not written until the 1850s, George Sand is still struggling with who, when she was a little girl, she should have been loyal to and who she should have identified with, because the women, who are both strong characters, very much set it up as you have to choose which way you'll go. You have to choose which version of the family you're part of, which is tough for a child.
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of custody battle between two women in a way.
Yeah, and I think it's something that is that really shines through in your book. You've got really 4 generations, because you've got the grandmother, the mother, you've got George, and then her own daughter later, and you just have these incredibly complex mother-daughter relationships and incredibly complex people who want and don't want the same things all at once throughout their entire lives. Yeah. And it's just still so preciously rare to see such complex female characters in history, and to be able to unearth all of that complexity of personality that is not that often recorded.
Yes, thank you, Isabel. Because I mean, one goes. I mean, every time I work on someone, I obviously sort of fall in love with them in a way, and I become more and more obsessed. And you go down all these, rabbit holes. And I think it's not a rabbit hole. I think it's actually a huge space for exploration. Is George? Let's call her George, and boyhood. That she, like Elizabeth Bat Browning, she records that when she was young, she wanted to be a boy, not a girl. She wanted those freedoms. She learns to horseback ride, and she rides bareback and not side saddle as young ladies were meant to, but in the English style, as she calls it. Her playmate is Nohant, is for a long time her older half-brother Hippolyte. So there's a kind of boyish formation. And also when Aurore's father dies, he falls, he's thrown by his horse and dies in a tragic accident, just when they've got to Nohant. So when Aurore is just 4, at that point, her grandmother in her grief sometimes calls Aurore, my son. She says she very much resembles Maurice when he was a boy, and there is clearly a sort of palimpsest relationship going on there in a way that obviously there wasn't with Hippolyte, even though Hippolyte came first, and even though Hippolyte is also a boy. So
Hmm.
there's all of that. And then in early adulthood, when Georges is laden with responsibility, she talks about no longer being a garçon, no longer being free to be a boy and to just go off to literary suppers or to sit around smoking and talking about books. She has to look after her children, she has to look after her household, she has to look after eventually Chopin and so on. So obviously the figure of the boy is a figure of freedom and identification for her in a way.
Mm. And funny enough, she reminds her grandmother of her son. She looks like her father. Later on, it's her own son who looks a lot like her and takes a lot after her, more so than her daughter. So again, you see these generational patterns. But let's talk about what it means to be as she's growing up. What it means to be a girl. What it means to be a young woman. We're in the for people who want a pop culture reference. We're in the Bridgerton years. I'm just thinking about it because it's on TV right now. It's not where you go for historical accuracy, but one thing that is really, really quite accurate actually is the position of young women and young girls and just how clueless they are made to be about the world. So Georges gets an education in an English convent, so she ends up with passable English as an English school in Paris. But the way girls are educated, they're educated to be good wives, essentially, right? They're not getting a very intellectual classical education the way boys are, and they're not educated either in the ways of the world. She has this wonderful sentence: "We raise them like saints, then hand them over like fillies." Talk about an indictment of what the early 19th century does to girls.
Yes, absolutely. And it takes her a long time to sort of learn that because I mean that wonderful sentence, I mean terrible sentence, comes from a letter to Hippolyte when they're both adults, when Hippolyte's own daughter is about to get married, sort of warning him, try and, give her some warning, try and give her some breathing room and so on. So that's the adult speaking, isn't it? But when she's in the convent, she's very quickly, first of all, she's a devil, she's a wild girl, but very quickly she learns to fit in and she becomes immensely popular and lessons come very easy to her. And quite soon she's writing plays and putting them on, and she's allowed to do this because there's quite a community there. There isn't just pupils and teaching sisters. There are also in the classical sense, women who have been sent to the convent to live or who've retired to the convent. So there is an adult community too. So it's a sort of mixed community, and she puts on entertainments for them. She stages Molière, and she also has a crush on. She has a spiritual confessor for the first time, but she also has a crush on the assistant to the Mother Superior, who is a half English woman, Mother, as she calls her. She's not Mother, actually, because she's not the Mother Superior, Spearing. And Sister Spearing inspires to such an extent that Aurore thinks she has a vocation. She's popular, not lonely. Her life is rich and varied. And, of course, this is not the programme at all. The programme is that she's supposed to acquire manners and a ladylike finish and then go home to Nohant. So after only 2 and a little bit years, when she's 15, her grandmother comes up to Paris and whips her off back to Nohant to be her companion. And then both restricts her life still further, but at the same time mocks the pietism and the little learning that were acquired in the convent. That's not rigorous, that's not. And in fact, is herself more educated than her granddaughter and challenges her in discussions and so on. And Aurore eventually, through sheer boredom, begins to educate herself, begins to read Rousseau, begins to read Leibniz, begins to read Thomas à Kempis, Imitation of Christ, finds that kind of emphasis on self-perfection even more isolating, depressing, so begins to read Chateaubriand, The Genius of Christianity, and suddenly sees Christianity as a way forward. It's about art and religion and public and collective and everything she was sort of doing at the convent. And so, in a sense, has her own very private autodidacticism. But it's very piecemeal. It's very happenstance and piecemeal. She only reads Chateaubriand because her local confessor suggests it, and because Chateaubriand is immensely popular and influential just at that point. And she's very failed by her education. I think for contemporary readers, the result is she's very readable. She doesn't write the kind of French that's formal and throat-clearing and ornate, and she doesn't write the French of 19th century novels. She writes something that's very immediate. She doesn't have a particularly vast vocabulary. It's extremely accessible and quite informal, and a very fast read, as indeed she was a very fast writer. So there are benefits from her lack of education, but it is very much a girl's education.
And that's something you see a lot, I think, in the 19th century. You see women writing for a growing female readership, like a lot of female writers and a lot of female readers, and also men. But the common men, the ordinary men, they're excluded out of higher education, and also therefore out of maybe slightly more pretentious or elite or academic kind of writing.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one thing is that it makes me think again of Mary Shelley and Frankenstein and how readable Frankenstein is compared to Mary Shelley's own later novels when she sees herself as more of a literary figure. And actually compared to Percy Bysshe's little, interventions of change your description here, he always changes her prose into something stuffier. So there definitely is that. I think that one of the ways in which George Sand's timing was very lucky, I mean, when she's George Sand, is that she is becoming a writer at the time that literacy is increasing. There are more and more church schools, but there was also, compulsory education is gradually coming in, so that there's the rise of a new literate middle class, the bankers and shopkeepers. And well before the end of her life, there is universal, as it were, literacy. And with that is a great rise in the number of kind of professional outlets, the number of periodicals she can write for, the number of editors. There's a whole expansion of a kind of working, as it were, commercial literary and writing world in Paris, as also in London. But obviously the timing is different because their states are so different. And I think that means that, reading becomes reading percolates down, reading for leisure percolates down many more layers of society. So a common touch, as it were, is suddenly a door opener to readers and reputation rather than the opposite.
And so that takes us to her adult life, the start of her professional career. Her adolescence, really her youth or her childhood, ends with the death of her grandmother, who she takes care of. She gets married almost instantly. Thereafter,
married, yeah.
And does really the expected, married at 18, she's a mother at 19. She really starts out like any young woman of her age. When does that take a turn? When does she start to become the woman that we're going to know? When does she start really writing as a profession?
She starts writing really quite late. There are sort of 8 years of marriage before she really tries her luck as a writer. And during that time, for much of the time, she's just restless and gradually unpicking her marriage by infidelity, and the marriage is failing in all sorts of ways. So she's doing a lot of rather unsatisfactory provincial living. And then in 1831, she has an affair with a law student called Jules Sandeau. And as all students, not all students, but all the students she's involved with, he's a student in Paris, but he's back in La Châtre, her local town, for the summer, which is how they meet. And conveniently, at the end of that summer, she discovers that her husband, Casimir Dudevant, has framed his will, but he's framed it in terms of such fury and contempt for her that she understands it's not that he's just clumsy, but really he loves her, and she's the problem. No, actually, he detests her. And that kind of gives her the emotional license to follow Sandeau to Paris. And she sets down the terms of, she frames it all as being her husband's fault, which is another form of female self-erasure, but we won't go there. And she sets up an arrangement where she'll spend 3 months in Paris, 3 months back in Nohant with her children, 3 months in Paris, 3 months back in Nohant with her children. And she goes to Paris, and during the months before, she has been playing at writing. She's been trying to turn a travel journal into a book. She can't quite do it yet. She hasn't got the skills and so on. But she's very clever at discovering what she needs, which is a framework. And almost immediately when she gets to Paris, 2 things happen. One, she and Jules have been playing at co-writing short stories, and 1 or 2 of their stories seem to have been accepted. Actually, then it turns out one of them hasn't been. They place a couple of stories in magazines. The other is that she herself goes to see the editor of the Figaro, Henri de la Touche, who turns out also to be from La Charte. And so she has an introduction from home. I mean, an extraordinary piece of luck. And they obviously get on. He obviously sees something in her because he immediately puts her on the staff, which, I mean, you wouldn't do if you were the editor of the Figaro and you were going to sully your reputation by just taking on some young woman from home. You wouldn't do that. You might try and offer to publish some of her fiction, but you wouldn't take her on. But he does. He takes her on. So she has a desk at the Figaro. And also realizes that nevertheless, she's still very short of money. And so he offers her and Sandeau the chance to do some ghostwriting, to ghostwrite a novel called The Commissionaire. Very quickly, in 4 weeks, which had already been commissioned, but the author died. And they do it. And one suspects that Aurore, she is still, does most of it. But they do it. And the publishers are pleased enough that they then pitch a novel that they themselves co-write called Rose et Blanche. And that too is published within, this is all in 1831. That too is published before the end of the year. And most of that has actually been written by Aurore. And this is published under the pseudonym of J. Sand. So it's not yet, it's no longer Sandeau, to kind of equalize it up a little bit. And again, at the suggestion of Henri de la Touche. So it all happens within a year, this commercial writing. And then in April 32, when she comes back to Paris after her next 3 months at home, she comes back not only with her 3-year-old daughter, bizarrely, because it's also into the middle of a cholera epidemic, but she comes with a manuscript of what will be her incredibly successful debut novel, which is Indiana, and which is the first novel she's written by herself. So it happens really quickly, but it does happen through contacts.
Yeah. So Jules Sandeau, obviously his legacy is to have eventually given her the name. So, you know, when, as you say, when they co-write, it's J. Sand, and it over the time changes. She changes it to Georges Sand. Georges,
Well,
with an S, the French spelling. And I've always wondered, how does she come to the English spelling of Georges? Where does that come from?
She lapses from Georges. So she's G, just G on the title page of Indiana. And she is Georges. She's still being called Aurore by people in her own life, and including Paris friends. But she gradually, in 1832, when she comes back to Paris that autumn after the next trip home to Nohant, she doesn't move back in with Sandeau, and she is Georges at this point. But during the coming months, while she's living on her own in a new apartment, she gradually drops the S. She rehearses dropping it. And I wonder if it's partly because it's the English name and she went to the English school, or whether it's partly because Sand is anyway an abbreviation of Sandeau, and George is an abbreviation of Georges. And obviously I wonder whether there is, I mean, it's not literal cross-dressing, in other words, sort of nominal cross-dressing. It's a male nom de plume, but there's give even within that. And why she has a male nom de plume, I mean, that's, you know, not mysterious at all, is it? This is the era, when she will be succeeded by George Eliot, but I mean, it's the era of the Brontë sisters being, you know, the Bell brothers and so on. It's not, Mary Shelley is anonymous, and Jane Austen is anonymous. She's a lady, I mean, admitting her gender, but not, you know, women publishing under their own name is still so problematic that I don't think that we can read anything into the fact she has a approximately male nom de plume. But nevertheless, she does, and she has an English one.
And actually, well, since I was going to talk about it later, but since you're starting on this, that's the thing I find fascinating. So first, she co-writes with a man, which helps her get published, and she adopts a male nom de plume, which, as you say, incredibly common. It was just being seen as a writing woman. It was quite damaging to one's reputation. Probably didn't sell books as well either. So again, very practical. And this is also the time as she works as a reporter at Le Figaro in a very male world. Some of the comments she makes made me laugh because I started my career at Le Figaro about 200 years after her. And I recognized so much of it. It's a very masculine environment. Even in early 21st century, it was. But so there she starts, you know, dressing as a man. And it seems to be not really some grand statement about her own gender identity or wanting to be a man, it certainly shouldn't put modern ideas of trans identity or anything like that on top of that. It is practical. It is being a woman at that time is a bit of a cage and stops what you can do and who you can be. And she just wants to be a person without being limited by a gender. And therefore, sometimes she takes on the attributes of men because it's way more convenient to go around Paris in trousers, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that she is very much wearing it as a costume. I think she is saying, I'm not going to pretend. I'm not going to hope that I pass as a man, although possibly on a rainy night with my hat well down. She is more saying, this is the costume of touch me not. Oddly, given that we think of her as someone who was promiscuous, as she was.
It's safer. It's much safer.
Safer. And it's also more authoritative. She has this lovely quote about being at the figure and saying, if you can make yourself indispensable in an editorial office, it's the best thing because it has nothing to do with your personality, ellipsis, and your gender. So it's a way of saying, this is a writer's costume. I'm a writer. Okay, yes, I admit it, I've got curls. Okay, I admit it, I'm wearing a corset. But I'm a boy and I'm playing the role of a boy, a bit like a leading boy in a pantomime, an English pantomime. It's not sexual play because, interestingly, in her private life, she wears frocks. In her private life, when she's dating all these men, she's frocked up. She's not wearing men's clothes for the bedroom at all. She's wearing clothes precisely, really, for the outside world. And also, of course, passing in the sense that it's hard. Places where women can't really go, like the gallery at the opera and so on. In men's clothes, she can pass enough that, whereas if she were wearing a coloured frock, obviously she'd stand out a mile. Not that I think that people look at her like a Shakespearean heroine and, which gender is she? I think it's that she's just saying, take me as seriously as you take yourself.
Yeah. And it's fascinating. I think it's something that's also very much sort of embedded in the French language, which is a gendered language, right? It's got the feminine and masculine nouns are feminine or masculine. When people are trying to, even give her compliments, male writer, you're talking about her as this great man, or there's something about the French language that even if there exists a feminine version of a particular word, like author, it is less than. And to use, we even do it in English, some actresses go by actor because actor sounds more serious. And, even today in France, people will debate whether the word ministre, the word for minister, government minister, should be feminized or not. And it's fascinating. Words become feminized when they become less a status, essentially. Yeah. It's a fascinating trait of language. And so again and again, even her friends and her male friends in the arts call her by male names,
Exactly. And most famously, Flaubert, towards the end of her, in the last decade of her life, calls her dear master.
Cher maître.
Not mistress, but dear with the feminine form.
Which is the word that you use. Yes, maître is the word that you use today still to address a barrister. And we do not feminize it. Female barristers are called maître, not maîtresse, mistress, so master. It's fascinating, and it's a lot of the gender expectations that are embedded in French culture and therefore in French society, which are hard to convey in translation, but I think was an important point to make.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I think that it makes it even clearer that she's very early trying to rock that linguistic and conceptual boat, isn't she? Obviously, when Flaubert says maître, he's talking about an artistic master. And I suspect there were no female barristers in those days, so all barristers were maîtres. So when she is dear, female form, cher, then something really is rocking in the language. And it's the same with her lover, Alfred de Musset, the poet. He addresses her, oh, my... Now, let me get it right. Oh, my George. And my is...
Ma?
Mon.
Mon.
No,
Mon. Okay, so it's the masculine.
And then he says, my dear mistress, ma chère. So he says she's both mon and ma in the same sort of exclamation, the same greetings.
Yeah. I find that fascinating because, yes, the way that she presents her gender identity, I think, has more to do with the limitations of the world around her and the language that she has to use than anything to do with her own identity, which she seems quite secure in. So you mentioned her first novel. We've
Yeah.
gone all over the place.
Yes.
But and success comes quite quickly.
Yes.
And you also mentioned she's incredibly productive. I mean, the pace at which she writes is insane. I think partly because she needs to earn, right? She has children. Her husband is, or ex-husband is not very helpful. I think Jules Sandeau is the first, but she attaches herself again and again to younger men, and takes on a caretaker role and ends up looking after their careers, their finances, there's a lot of people who are reliant on her.
Yeah. Yeah. She is. She's a workhorse. I mean, by the time she is, well, to take a very classic example, by the time she's with Chopin, and for the years that she supports him, the 9 years she supports him, for much of that time she's raising both children and she's also acting as tutor to those children. So during the day, she runs the household, looks after Chopin, and tutors her kids. And then at night, she writes novels. Well, when does she sleep? She sleeps for sort of 4 hours. And friends and peers talk to her about her as being a sort of writing machine. The Goncourt brothers, for example, talk about her as being like that. And sure enough, she's quite a relatively, by the standards of her day, she's quite a late starter. And yet, by the end of her life, there will be 70 novels, there will be many successful stage plays, there will be criticism, there will be autobiography, there will be travel writing. I mean, she's astonishingly prolific. And you're right, Indiana is followed very quickly by Valentine, and then the next year by Lelia. And all three of them are about the condition of women under particularly arranged marriage, and the kind of that arranged marriage is not just ho 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 what a drag, but is actually an absolute tragedy for women, that prevents they have no autonomy, but also prevents them coming into selfhood of any kind. So and they get progressively darker. So those three first novels do. So while Indiana is a terrific success because it's driven by emotion and the argument, but it's reasonably melodramatic. By the time she gets to Lelia, she's really arguing against the institution of marriage per se, and that makes her popular neither with traditionalists nor with radicals like Saint-Simonists who want to change other things but aren't particularly worried about the state of women.
Yeah, let's talk about her writing, since, as we've pointed out, we need to talk about her writing and not just her relationships to put her back in the canon. What kind of literature does she write, and how does that compare to what's going on in the time? I think we think of 19th century, you've got the romantics, and then you've got the very political sort of Hugo, Zola criticism of society. Where does she fit?
Well, where she differs from Hugo and Zola and Balzac and his human comedy is that it's not that all her protagonists are female, but they are centrally female, and that she tends to be up close on a paradigmatically difficult situation rather than kind of big canvas crowd scenes. So she will look at how a marriage inevitably falls apart when, effectively, the husband owns a wife, and the writing, which tends to be quite emotional and quite urgent and fast, and as a strategy of celerity, as Hélène Cixous will, a long time in the future, say. There's a passionate argumentation from ideals about equality and the importance of women in their lives, but that's often misheard as, oh, this is just a story about private lives, or this is just a love story, or a failed love story. But, of course, it's not. It's a critique of society in exactly the same way as the men are critiquing their society. And I think one of the tragedies of subsequent reception of Sand, or at least 21st century reception, is the sense that, oh, well, yeah, but those novels don't read to us as political now because we don't live like that now. Number one, there is arranged marriage in many parts of the world, so yes, we do. But also, number two, but nobody says that about Les Miserables or whatever. Oh, we don't need to read that now because that was Paris in the 19th century. Society is different now. But it's that sense of, it's the old sense of the male as a universal human condition and the female as, not only diminished, but as an exception, a special case of minority interest. And so I think because later she founds progressive reviews and so on, so the kind of progressive politics of her writing is often forgotten, but it's a motor. And I think she had the courage to not just write from sentiment like, wouldn't it be nice if these people fell in love, but to write from ideals, so convictions which are held, but which she allows to be held within the emotions as well as within argumentation. And obviously, for a storyteller, that's a significant gift. I think the other thing, two things she does, which are very pioneering, is that she's the first. She writes about the lives of the rural poor, and again, this is decades before Thomas Hardy will in English. And she writes about those lives as being full of dignity and meaning, but nevertheless not sentimentally pastoral and, oh, Hesiod, oh, well, they're so wise, live in the country. No, she's showing the life is pretty awful. But she's also saying that the people themselves are not pretty awful. They're understandable, they're human relatable. So she's according a real dignity to another group who have still not achieved equality after the revolution, after the various iterations of empire and so on.
Mm.
And the third thing she does is that she has this kind of ecological understanding. So when she writes about the natural world, she understands it as interconnected and that we affect it and affects us, but that it is independent of us. And that's ecology, and that's not just countryside settings or rural settings or nature writing. That's something much more than that. That's actually ecology. So I think in all three ways she's very significant. And then, of course, she's just very significant because she is enlivening. She's part of this great, miraculous 19th century flowering of the realist novel. And she's doing it with her own particular diction. And so in all those ways, she's creating a certain fluency and immediacy. We were talking about this in a way earlier, weren't we? In the texture of what you get to read. And she's a huge role model as well, because although she writes under a pen name, everybody knows she's that woman over there, even if they no longer know that she's actually Aurore Dudevant by marriage. And she's very important to the other women writers, but presumably, as you also say, to women readers. So the Brontë sisters, for example, they definitely model themselves on. They read her with fascination, and they model her. Wuthering Heights is quite a Georges Sand kind of novel.
Mm. So her success travels in her lifetime. She's read in translation.
She's more widely read in translation in this country than Hugo. Well, they're both alive.
Wow.
She knows everyone. Matthew Arnold, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Ruskin in this country, but Liszt as well as Chopin, Delacroix, all the writers of her era. I mean, there's a tremendous sort of, and they all speak to her about her behind her back as well as to her face as a literary figure of the utmost seriousness and importance. They don't dismiss her, interestingly. There's a sense of, she's definitely part of their contemporary pantheon and should remain there. And I think they would be astonished that she has vanished to the extent that she has.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when she dies, Victor Hugo, he's one of those men who uses that great man image because just great woman, I guess, hasn't entered the vocabulary. But yes, and she has this lovely friendship with Flaubert at the end of her life in epistolary. She writes a huge number of letters and writes them quite literary, right? She writes letters the way that one might write books. Of course, it's a thing that is done in the 19th century. People are much better letter writers than we are.
But it's still astonishing, isn't it? Because again, that's another part of her productivity. I mean, there are thousands of surviving letters. She just, obviously with the Graphomain, she never stopped. It's just extraordinary. And the diction is very similar, inquiring, quite present as a personality in her letters, as she is in her novels, intimate, enthusiastic. You feel there's some kind of writerly honesty, although whether that can be the case, I don't know.
One thing I think you see in her letters as well, and I think that's something that is a bit of a theme throughout your book, is this idea of the creation of identity, right? She's telling a story about herself to the friend who's reading her, to us,
Yes.
reading her later on. She's kind of always inventing and reinventing her own identity and her own personality.
Yes, and I am fascinated by that. I'm fascinated with all these women, with these three women, by how they invented themselves as writers. That's to say, how they swam against the tide of social expectation right at the outset of their lives and then continued to do so. I mean, not only how did they acquire the accomplishment to do what they did, but how did they have the courage to do it? But I'm also very interested in how people become in general. I am quite a believer in subjects and process. I think people shape themselves and are shaped by life, and not only in an early life psychoanalytic way. And I think that these women, figures like George Sand, who travelled such an enormous distance from where she started, the process of self-invention is really apparent. And I think it's apparent in, the life story and the achievement, but it's also, I think, apparent in, again, that layering, that palimpsest sense around her final or her later iterations of who she is. When she stops having to be in Paris to be a success, and she's able, even for stage, what we call West End, to have a lot of success on the Paris stage, she can still write those plays and have them rehearsed in Nohant, and she doesn't need to be in Paris all the time. So she goes back and settles mainly in Nohant, which she's owned all her life, of course, since she's inherited at 17. But she makes it a sort of literary centre, a centre of productivity. But she isn't a salonière. She becomes the good woman of Nohant. She becomes very generous, does good works to poor people in the neighbourhood and so on, and becomes very practical in running the home farm and having a well-appointed kitchen and so on. So she becomes this other iteration, this matron in a way, but at the same time, she's also the master. And I think that's just extraordinarily interesting that these things coexist, that there isn't this kind of essentialist polarization. There is a simultaneity, but it's not chaotic. She has produced a mixture which works for her. She has found a way. And I do think it's summed up in the book. I've got these periodic impressions, and they are portraits of her taken at various times during her life. And you can see her selfhood, in a sense, changing in them. And you can see how her selfhood is something that is in the eye of the beholder, to the society around her very much creates her reputation, but it's also something she is doing and inventing. So there's this dialectic. And in the last image I've got in the book, there's a photo of the great photographer Felix Nadar takes a set of photos, and some of the photos in that last sitting she does for him, she is dressed as Molière. Molière, who's been someone who's mattered to her all her writing life. She staged Molière when she was at school. She's written a play about Molière, in fact, in her later life. But there she is, and she's wearing the Molière wig and a cloak, and she looks like the portraits of Molière, but she also looks like herself. And you see this figure of authority, which is a woman's face, but as it were in the role, but the role of a man, not being a man, not wanting to be a man, but assuming the role. And the role, of course, is not as a man. The role is as an author of authority. And I think that getting to that point, inventing female authority, is just stunning.
And she invents herself as well, as we all do, through the relationships that she embarks on. And I think it's fascinating that we're coming to the end of our hour and we've barely talked about them, even though that's what she is so perhaps most known for today, at least in the pop culture. And I think that proves our point from the beginning, which is she is so much more than that. But I will just mention them and then people can read the book, because otherwise that's a whole hour, another hour of our conversations. But obviously the most famous one, as you mentioned, was Chopin, who is actually a fairly short relationship in the traditional sort of romantic and sexual understanding of the word, but then remains a presence in her life. And she and his really for quite a long time. And you have Alfred de Musset before, the young poet, the probably more famous of the many younger men that she has known. And Marie Dorval, who is the only woman I think that she is known to have had a relationship with. So again, we have this image of this sort of bisexual, gender-bending queer icon. There is a quite short, maybe relationship, we're not even 100% sure, with a woman in her youth.
We're not absolutely sure, but I think one has to argue quite hard to try and dissolve that relationship. Mm-hmm. But there is absolutely no evidence of any other women, and definitely she has very much a sexual romantic type, and it is the younger man. It is the garçon again. Mm. But I still think she remains a queer icon, because I think it's queer in the sense of not really who you sleep with, but queering what being a woman is. I think that's where possibly the richness of her as a figure for us now is most significant. That she's, in a sense, says to us over and over, well, whatever the convention of the cage of convention you have to be in, happen to be in right now, no, think around it, reinvent it, see what you can do with it, see how you can play with it, see what you might change. And to me, that's very rich, that sort of elective queering.
Yeah, it does feel like if she had had another 100 years, there would have been another 10 versions of her.
Well,
We would have known her by other names and
yeah.
other associations and other interests. Fiona, thank you so much. It's been really, really interesting conversation. I had no idea when I started reading into Georges Sand, who I again barely knew, that there would be just so much there to learn and to be inspired by. So thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Isabel. It was a joy talking.